Thank you very much, Miki. Hi, everyone. Welcome also from me to the Singapore FinTech Festival and to this panel hosted and organized by Ubin Channel and R3. My name is Jo Wissing, and I am based here in Singapore with Lloyds Bank Corporates Market, looking after our trade sales for FI and MBFI clients. And I'm very, very delighted today to be joined by some industry-leading experts in the field to discuss with you the topic of trade finance. Are we moving from silos to siloed networks? Now, I'm sure that most of you, or even all of you on this session today, will agree with me that trade finance has been for quite a while in need of change and of digital transformation. And the last decade has seen a lot going on in this space, in particular the last 2 to 3 years, and even more so in 2020, driven by the need of having to work different ways. We've definitely seen that digital transformation taking rapid pace. For example, with a lot of the initiatives that we're seeing also in the blockchain space, which is quite an important field, certainly for trade, because it has got a lot of good user cases in trade finance. But with the emergence of multiple platforms and solutions, are we actually moving from silos to siloed networks? And how can we help the industry to advance from actually just connecting players to having connected networks? Or are we actually looking at competitive dynamics that will ultimately see us ending up with a very fragmented ecosystem? Those are some of the questions that I'd love to try and answer today through our panelists. And as I say, I'm very delighted to have such an expert panel with us. To briefly introduce themselves, we have today with us Karl Wegner, who is the CEO of Contour, and who is a long-standing thought leader in trade finance innovation. Karl has got more than 30 years experience in Asia in trade finance, financial institutions, supply chain finance management, and distributed ledger technologies. And prior to becoming the CEO of Contour, Karl was for Asia for R3 before he held various senior positions at several banks, again, all in the Asia region. And I dare to say he's an expert certainly in China in terms of he's fluent in Mandarin, and he holds a BSc in Chinese language and history. Further, we've got Munib Shah from R3, where he heads trade, supply chain, and the energy industry business units based in London. He's got over 14 years of experience of leading implementations of cross-industry blockchain solutions. In his current role with R3, he focuses on building ecosystems and consortia for physically applicable use cases, and he is a leading advisor in identifying use cases that make sense for implementation in blockchain environments. Munib holds a master in business management, and he is a computer science engineering graduate. And last but not least, I'm very happy to have Sam Matthews on the panel, who runs documentary trade for Standard Chartered Bank. Sam is also the chief product owner for any replatforming activity that's happening in the trade finance space at Standard Chartered, and as such is, of course, actively looking to use the latest open banking and microservices-based technologies. And therefore, we'll be very happy to hear from his perspective, sort of like one of the main users as a banker and as a leading trade finance bank in the space. Sam holds a first honors degree from Bombay University and also a Master of Business Administration from Nanyang University. So yeah, very happy today to have such an expert panel with us. And hence, without further ado, we'd like to dive straight into the subject matter. And well, we're here to speak networks today, but I think even before we go into that, Sam, from your perspective, and with the background of the experience that you must have had over the last few years looking at the replatforming, what is the current status quo of digitizing trade, and what tech developments are you particularly seeing in the space?
Thanks, Joanna. Hi, everyone. So I would say I would bucket it into 3 buckets. One is the banks on proprietary channels. So there's a lot of work, banks have traditionally invested in proprietary channels, and that will continue. I would say proprietary plus Swift still forms a large part of the digital flows that come into the bank, right? At least from a trade finance and cash management perspective. The second bucket is where all the platforms, consortiums, partnerships are. And I think that to a large extent is also driven by the technology and the need to find efficiency. But more importantly, the buying behavior of how trade finance is bought is changing. So trade finance in terms of, or the commercial activity in terms of buyers and sellers are moving to marketplaces, even with corporates, and therefore trade finance is going to get plugged into those marketplaces. So those kind of partnerships. So platforms, marketplaces, consortiums, I would say is the second bucket. The third bucket, Joanna, is where you're using technology to drive efficiency and risk management. So this will be technologies like OCR, NLP, because paper is going to be here to stay for a while at least, using it for AI-based credit modeling and fraud risk modeling, etc., internally in the bank's backend, and even with some of the non-bank lending platforms. So those, I would say, are the three verticals or three streams. Now, within that second stream is where we have a plethora of players, be it platforms providing niche services, consortiums like some of the ones that we are partnering with, like Contour today, Carl is on the panel, and others, marketplaces, etc. And which is where I think eventually, and these are not interoperable, right? So I mean, the topic today is from silos to siloed networks. I like to call them digital islands. Eventually, these digital islands will need to start talking to each other, become interoperable, or there will be eventually consolidation, I think, happening in that space, in order to build scale. So that, in a nutshell, I think is what I see as the lay of the land. Back to you, Joanna.
That's great, and thank you very much, Sam, for exactly laying out the landscape for us like that, which is very interesting. And you mentioned already the term digital islands. Whereas, of course, we want to focus on building networks. So having heard from Sam, I'm keen for Carl and Munib for your thoughts on looking at networks then. How do you see networks evolving, and how can they actually also help to drive digitization? Very keen to hear from both of you. So perhaps we'll start with you, Munib.
Sure. Thank you, Joanna. So I think, the points that Sam brought forward are very relevant, and, these three buckets is what we broadly see in the industry as well. When we talk about trade finance as of today, specifically, and we're talking about networks like Contour who are coming up and, being the digital pillars for that new age enablement, I think the first thing that we need to consider is that one of the key enablers of digital transformation today, according to a lot of industry experts, analysts, advisors, etc., is blockchain, right? Which was not advertently considered as one of the digital pillars a few years back. But thankfully, we have now moved to a world wherein we are looking at and seeing the benefits of having blockchain as a key digital enabler in that space. Now, with these networks coming up, while they are fulfilling immediate needs from a digital perspective in terms of becoming digitally native in a specific area of trade, but we are also now seeing that confluence wherein these networks are interoperating with each other, or for that matter, are interoperating with the legacy systems. So there's a strong correlation between these digital islands, as we may call them, but still working very closely with your backend ERP systems, and also possibly working hand in hand with other networks and ledgers and digital islands as we move forward.
Thank you, Munib. Carl, would you like to add anything there from Contour perspective?
Yeah, no. Again, Contour is a network of banks and corporates and technology providers, that facilitate trade finance made easier for all parties. But the technology providers are a big part of it, right? We realize that we can't build everything ourselves, right? We need to collaborate with, other services, and we work with technology providers that are built on, Corda, on Ethereum, on Fabric, on or non-blockchain, right? Or like you said, Munib said, the legacy systems, right? You're not going to replace everything overnight, right? You're going to have to deal with also work with the legacy systems. So, but I think that, interoperability, obviously very important. You can do a lot of that through APIs now. I think, setting standards is important, but also having scale is also important, right? Because this goes back to about 5 years ago when I was at R3, and a lot of talk was like, well, interoperability about all the blockchain platforms 5 years ago. And we thought about it and realized, what interoperability of what, right? If you have nothing going on, if you don't have business, already active on the platform, you're theoretically talking about, okay, in the future, but you can't plan for that, right? You have to have actual business. When you have actual business, then you can talk about the touch points. And so when I'm talking with partners, I very often say, if we have some overlap, that's good. That means we have something to share and work together with, right? If we have no overlap, well, then we're not competitors, that's for sure, but there's nothing to talk about. So I think there has to be scale of the different systems, the different networks, so that they do understand, where they're going to work together. And the key point is where the nexus is, right? Where the customers are, whether the banks or the corporates, right? Where they want different companies, networks to work together, then they're going to work together. That's what's going to drive it.
There's some very important points there for sure. I'd say, particularly as you say, like you need scale, right? I mean, any network certainly needs scale. We're looking at legacy systems. We're looking at, as Munib is saying, connectivity into ERP systems. I mean, Sam, on that note, I would like to turn back to you actually, and from your experience of re-platforming, and particularly with everything that's going on in the open banking space. How do you see progress going at the moment?
So I think the technology, Joanna, is not the problem. The technology exists, and a blockchain is a technology. APIs are a piece of technology, and from a technological construct perspective, the ability to interoperate is there, right? It does get a little trickier if you're talking about interfacing between two different types of blockchain or blockchain technologies, and having the hash record pass through. That becomes a little bit more complicated, but you can achieve it if you really want to. But that's not the point. I think the problem is more about the legality of it, and the standards in terms of data and legal standards and title, for example, moving. So if it all comes back to why are we trying to digitize, right? The trade in margins in trade finance have probably are 1/3 of what it was 5-10 years ago. The cost of doing business has gone up multiple times. So whenever we look at any use case, I think we need to look at why are we doing it, and to that extent, if you need to then build scale and interoperability has to be achieved, then it comes back to the technology does exist, but what is the impetus or the force that is going to bring these islands together to force that cooperation or drive that cooperation and interoperability happening, and that sometimes is not very clear from a business perspective and also from a legal and standards perspective.
And indeed, I guess that's another challenge along those paths. I mean, from the perspective of being sort of like, I hate the term vendor, but being the technology providers. Munib, how would you say generally across R3, across Corda, you address these concerns that are more sort of like on the legality perspective, on the regulatory perspective, on basically the overall framework, so to say, keeping pace with the digital evolution?
Sure. So I think there are two points before we get into the governance part of it. So when we talk about interoperability broadly, what do we mean by interoperability, right? Because from a technologist perspective, if I look at blockchain per se, interoperability means that I have the same state of a transaction at an atomic level in both the ledgers at a given point of time. And we are a little far away from that yet. We might not even need that yet, in all a sense. But what we are now talking about is integration and integrating two different ledgers. So basically passing information from one of these ledgers to another, which fulfills a certain business process. And this integration is driven by key constructs of the use case. And as Sam was mentioning, the technology exists, but it's about what the business case mandates and what it deems fit. And we have been able to do that, right? So we have, as Carl also mentioned earlier, we have been able to integrate between different ledgers, say Hyperledger and Corda, Ethereum and Corda, and we have been able to bring in that synergy that one part of an application is being executed, say, on Ethereum, but the payments and the settlements and the financing part of it is what we are executing on Corda. So from a technology perspective, we are pretty spot on with that. With respect to governance, I think it's all about the target operating model in terms of how you want to operate, who takes the liabilities, and where does the legal construct lie. For example, let's take an example of an application which is, say, predominantly working on Ethereum, but their settlements and payments need to be happening on a Corda blockchain. So in that case, the liabilities would be defined in a way that your core application liabilities do lie on the other ledger, but the payments obligations fall on us or our banking partner. So we do work in terms of building that governance upfront as soon as we start progressing with the use case and the design of it. So the governance elements do come into perspective at that point of time.
That's very interesting. Thank you for that, because I mean that's interesting to hear. The sort of like actually the challenge nowadays is not around actually so much the interoperability in terms of making sure that, let's say, a hyperledger talks to a Corda. But I guess the governance around that is quite important. And then I guess my other question would be, and I'll open it up. I mean, to whoever's got first thoughts on that, is how does the connectivity work ultimately with, let's say, either the financial institution, and I know that Munib, you've got a lot of experience, I think, with implementing solutions with central banks, FIs, etc. Through across Corda, and so does you, Carl. So on the one hand, the connectivity with financial institutions, and then also with, of course, corporates and their ERP systems, depending on what we're looking at, whether that be a blockchain-based interface or whether that's just some sort of other API connection, etc. Because I can still see that being a major challenge.
I mean, I'll start out. I mean, again, it's whether it's corporates, I mean, or banks, right? There's trade finance. There's a handful of sort of major, trade finance systems. They're out there, but when you talk about integration and in Contour, it's really endearing now that everyone's asking us about integration, which is fantastic, which means people are serious, right? If it's integration, means you're going to invest in integration, means you're going into production, means you have scale. It's not a pilot. It's not a small scale anymore. And so people are asking a lot about that. Now, integration is just with the trade finance system is not necessarily much of a challenge, right? It's APIs you can connect, but trade finance is not just one system. Right, it's risk systems. It's AML. It's compliance. There's a lot of different systems, right? And so it's also interesting to see that is it really just connecting to SAP, for instance, for a corporate? Is that it? Well, okay, let's think about it. SAP, which version of SAP, right? Or which version of a bank trade finance system, right? The bank trade finance systems are really eager to link with some of these new platforms, but they're linking with their newest version, right? They may not be linking with their 20-year-old version that a bank still may be using, or a 10-year-old version, right? So it's not just saying simple, let's just connect to this system, or which version of it. So I think that's where integration is going to take a little bit more than just the APIs. It's going to take a plan. It's probably going to take an integration company to come, or an expert to come and do the analysis, the different systems, what's the timing of, you can do integration. Maybe we wait to integration until we upgrade our system, right? Should you spend the time of integration to a 20-year-old system, or wait 6 months? So it's easy to say integration, and technically it's not that hard, but I think sometimes the planning of it, that's where the rubber hits the road. You really have to think about that seriously. What pieces are we going to add, when, how, and what is your short, medium, long-term plan?
Joanna, if I may, I have a slightly different view, and I won't entirely disagree with Carl and Munib, but just in terms of how I look at it. So technical integration is not a problem. I think we have stated that multiple times on this panel. But let's take a real scenario, okay? So let's say we have an importer in Singapore that is banking with XYZ Bank, and he or she is also as an importer on the Contour platform, for example. However, the exporter he or she is dealing with is with another bank and in another country, right? Now, for this to work seamlessly, ideally all these parties should be on Contour, right? As an example, or any network. I'm just taking Contour as an example. Now, let's say they are on another blockchain platform and it happens to be Corda or Ethereum. Can we integrate? Technically, as Munif said, very possible. But these are two different business networks. The rule books, the licensing, the commercials are very different. And I'm just taking an example of two. When you start looking at the chain, the logistics company, the insurance provider, the Chamber of Commerce, the bill of lading, there are multiple parties involved. So bringing them, all of them into one chain is difficult. That would be ideal. In the absence of that, how do you drive that business and commercial integration? The technical integration, once we agree standards and APIs, is possible. But if your parties in your trade chain are on 5, 6, 10 different ecosystems or digital islands or silos, how do you bring that that business integration such that you only join one, and as the importer in Singapore, in my example, you can actually receive digital documents, data, whatever it is from your exporter, send the digital letter of credit to from your bank to the other bank. Yeah, you can see the Chamber of Commerce certificate. All of that is happening on one as far as the corporate is concerned, on one view, although they are very different platforms underneath. That to me is the challenge, because I think the impetus to get that business integration done is a lot more complicated than getting the technical integration done, in my view.
I would agree with you, Sam, but just to that point, as I explained earlier, I think where we are right now, that we have been able to achieve some sort of a business integration between these digital islands. When I talked about integration between Ethereum and Corda earlier, it was not just about the technical integration piece of it. It was actually about a bundle of messages coming in from Ethereum into Corda, which are business-specific transaction messages, and Corda being able to do the validations and work around those messages, pass the inputs back to Ethereum for the next set of actions to happen. So that kind of an integration is what we are working towards. And as you rightly mentioned, technical integration, not a problem. Most of these protocols have standard SDKs available through which you can connect using APIs. It's identifying the core essence of business, right, which needs that integration. So how do you pass documents from one ledger to another? How do you pass messages from one ledger to another, which trigger the next set of business processes within respective ledgers? I think that's what we are talking about. And that's, to a certain extent, I do agree with you. It is challenging because, finding that sweet spot of where the confluence happens is the problem. But we have been working towards that. And I think some bit of it has been achieved as well, with our existing projects as we speak.
I think if you look at, again, there's different levels of integration. You have the technical integration. We've all agreed that that's doable, right? But then you have, is it two systems? Again, we're working with partners, right? Is it two systems? Is it just passing data between each other? Or is it potentially that you could key in data in one system and it updates in the other, right? Then you get to the level where, okay, you can a single sign-on and you can access both of them. Then to do that, that's the commercial integration, but you need the legal integration, right? So ideally, you'd have a system where you could log in, use it, and would you like to also have, this, KYC and sanction and other services as well? Well, click here and click through the contract, right? And then add other services, and so the legal integration. So there's lots of different levels of it for a system to really connect. Passing information back and forth is actually the easiest, right? And that's what we're doing now. The next level is where networks begin to talk about, okay, how do we build more commercial integration? If it updates on one system, does it show a milestone? It updates the bill of lading is now the title has been transferred. Does that update in Contour as a green light? Now it's moved over, right? So we have not just the data, but the processes, the workflows are also, I guess, mimicked on different platforms. But to do that, and again, the next thing would be, how do you sign up a single sign up for multiple services, right? And I think that's sort of the nirvana everyone would like. It's going to take time. And I think it's going to take a lot of this nuancing of, where does the customer want to come in, right? And you look at trade finance, it's really complicated, or trade, international trade, not about trade finance, international trade. Everyone thinks that they manage it from front to back, but they say, so what do you do? Why manage the container booking from front to back? Well, that's one component of it. But then you have trade finance, you have, sanctions, you have carriers. There's all these different components of trade. It's quite complicated. And we're going to see how the different components work together and collaborate, because no one can build one thing to do everything, right? We know that, right? So collaboration is, and it goes back to, to blockchain. Blockchain's a team sport, right? We're going to have to collaborate to make this work.
That's very interesting thoughts from all of you, and there's quite a lot in here. I mean, yeah. So I think we are quite clear by now, having fleshed out that really the technology as such is not so much the problem. It's more, well, on the one hand, it's about governance, and for example, creating those rules around single sign-on, and generally how would the legal integration work. I guess the other aspect is around is around the fact that trade finance is inherently complex. There is a lot to it, and some of it is really run off sort of like legacy systems and is maybe not that easy to grasp. I mean, given these challenges highlighted, how do you think as an industry we can work together to sort of like drive wider adoption around governance systems, to drive working together rather than working against each other? And I think that is certainly one of the important aspects, right? I mean, we know, for example, there is other companies out there that want to mirror and mimic what Contour is doing, and certainly I'm sure Contour is ahead of the game, but still there is competition out there. How do we get to a point where, we can basically develop this together? Because again, there is the danger that if we don't develop it together, we will end up with a lot of fragmented digital islands. And I know it's a tough question to answer, but I'd be very keen to hear all of your thoughts.
Okay, Carl, you want to go first, or you want me to go ahead? Okay, let me go ahead. So I think at the end of the day, Joanna, my simple view on this is, and as we said, the technical integration is probably the easy part. The business network integration and commercial integration is slightly more complicated. But at the end of all that, it has to be cheaper, faster, better for the end corporate, right, or the end client. Because remember, why are we doing this? We are doing this because we are saying paper is too inefficient. It is messy, a lot of manual handling. So if the guy is paying, if a client is doing, has a couple of resources handling paper in his back office, and he's dealing with a bank that is charging him $10 per transaction because it is all paper, by moving on to this integrated platform, it has to be definitely 5 times cheaper, right? Otherwise, it doesn't make economic sense. I personally think in terms of technology costs and the costs of blockchain technology, for example, and even non-blockchain, end-to-end, once we do this business integration, I don't think we are there yet, because they're all kind of digital islands. But to answer your question, how do we bring scale? How do we drive adoption? I think we need to have a common language. So if you look at what happened with Swift back in 1973, or what happened with how ships were loaded, it used to take 10-15 days to load a ship, till somebody from the trucking industry came along with the concept of a container, right, in the 1950s, and suddenly we have efficiency in terms of loading times dropping from 10-15 days to 24 to 48 hours. So similarly, we need to have that standardization. We need to have standardization in terms of the tech piece, which we have said repeatedly is easy to do, but also the legal and the commercial piece, such that, to Carl's earlier point, a customer is joining one platform, or a bank is joining one platform, but can necessarily buy and connect and buy pieces of service from other platforms, maybe on a pay-per-use models. And at the end of all that, it is definitely cheaper than what is status quo today. And that requires a lot more work than where we are at the moment, because what we are doing today is we have these individual initiatives saying, come and join me, I've solved this one problem. I've joined the bill of lading problem. But it's always part of a puzzle. The whole puzzle needs to come together, and end to end, it has to be a lot more efficient and cheaper. And that requires really concerted effort in terms of putting aside vested interest, maybe open sources, right? I mean, is there a standard construct for a bill of lading today? No. Is there a standard construct for a blockchain trade finance data exchange? No. I mean, ICC is working on it with the DSI initiative, etc. I think standards needs to evolve. So to me, it is about evolving standards, both legal and data and technology, coming to a point where it becomes seamless. And at the end of all that, this integrated network is actually much more cheaper and efficient than what banks and corporates are facing today.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. It's a journey, right? And I think one of the components is that also just focusing on standards is great, but you need to have some volume, some scale. I'm sure, when containerization, probably have to go do some history, right? Containerization started, it's not just every ship in the world started and built containers, right? Someone started it, it's a good idea. Let's talk with some other people. Let's talk to the other side, the terminals on the other side. You need to build a little bit of scale and learning before because right now to set the standards, sometimes I think everyone's worried about setting the standards. Well, that's good, but we need to drive some volume to understand how those standards may evolve. Now, some of it is another component of it is not trying to do everything new, right? And so, I mean, in Contour, we sort of figured, let's build a network based on a standard, letters of credit, right? Everyone does letter of credit exactly the same way. It takes 30 seconds to explain what we do, longer to say how we do it better, right? But instead of spending time building something new and then getting the whole world to understanding a new product, right? Sort of fixing what we have out there and making it more efficient is some ways a good stepping stone, and from that learning. But absolutely, standards got to be set, and the whole idea of, I think many of you talked earlier about, the data, right? I mean, ideally we want everything on, it would be wonderful if everything was structured data, it was all on one blockchain system or multiple blockchain systems, that it was all atomic, everyone knew, it was perfect data. We're not there yet, right? First thing, is just to get off paper. So you say we have structured data, right? Just to get feed, a feed, an API feed from an ERP system, just have structured data would be fantastic. But we have structured and electronic data, which is PDFs. Now that's good too, but then we have the OCR to read them and stuff like that. Then we have some paper too. So again, let's just get all the structured data, make that journey from paper to electronic, move to structured data. Then we can also then talk about, okay, let's get it all at an atomic level, transferring assets and stuff like that. That's far off in the future. And I don't think anyone really at the moment, if you look at a blockchain system, one or the other, well, this is better, this is safer, whatever. People are just happy to get the stuff electronically, right? Structured data. Eventually, when everything's structured data, then we're going to start looking at, well, which blockchain system is better? Which is more efficient? Which is safer? But that's going to be a ways away. We need to walk before we can run.
Exactly. I think you're spot on with that, Carl. And in fact, if you look at standards are evolving, and they take years to evolve and, become sort of set in stone wherein they can widely be consumed. And we have seen that very prevalently happening in the banking industry. For example, when we spoke about payments and when we started discussing ISO messaging, while it was a standard that every bank had to conform, but that standard had so much of variance that it's still evolving to a certain degree before being, set in stone. So I would agree with you in a way that, yes, we have to walk those initial to get scale, to get moving, and while we are working on standards as well. But at the same time, what I personally believe is that even if we have standards evolved, we'll still have these fragmented silos to a certain extent, because as you said, everybody thinks that I'm doing it the right way and my blockchain protocol is the best, and I have the users. So time would tell there, and consolidation would definitely happen, because ultimately the platforms which are heavy on user adoption, would succeed, and they would be able to consolidate the rest of them in terms of coupling together and interoperating to a much higher degree of level. So I think that's the way forward. And beyond that, if we look at standardization per se, right, I think it's not just about setting standards. It's about who is consuming those standards in the end. So, for example, if we talk about trade finance per se, who's your end consumer? Is it a bank? If it's a bank who's bringing in their customers and corporates to you, then the bank has to provide some sort of an omnichannel experience to their end users, because they provide letter of credit services. They also provide open account, and their users would be, obviously not happy if they have to go onto two different channels, log into two different modules, so on and so forth. So they have to speeden up their level of consolidation to provide that omnichannel experience back to their end customers. But if it's end corporates joining, and some of the corporates predominantly work only on letter of credit, so they're good for now, right? So we can scale them up, bring them up to speed with that adoption, get them going. Somebody wants to do open account financing only, so they can consume a specific platform and do it that way. But consolidation would happen more at a higher level, wherein the banking relationships come into perspective, and that needs to be standardized.
That's fantastic. There are some great thoughts here, especially because it gives me a lot of hope in a way to hear all that. Because again, I think what we're seeing is we are necessarily in an environment where competing technologies will ultimately leave us with a fragmented ecosystem, from what I can hear from the audience so far. But it's more around setting the standards, and I hear you loud and clear on that, Carl, in that you're saying it's a journey, and let's build a scale first, and maybe build on the basics, like, for example, in the standards, like letters of credit, and learn to walk before we can run. I know, Sam, you mentioned the common language, as, for example, created by Swift, as created by containerization. And then Munib, as you rightly say, the important thing to bear in mind is who are the consumers of these standards at the end of the day. And I think these are all very, very valid points. I'm very conscious of time. I probably we only have a few more minutes. I would be very, very happy, though, to hear from each one of you, and maybe just keep it to a minute or so. From everything that we've heard so far, do you feel generally that there is a danger of creating those silos and the digital islands? Is it too early to tell? Or are we at a real risk, or are we actually good because the technology will sort of like learn to adapt and the rest will fall into place?
So I can take the first step. I think, from my perspective, we are working towards that nirvana stage, right? So wherein consolidation would happen and we'll move away from these digital silos. But where we are in the journey right now, I think it's possible to accept these digital silos getting created, getting evolved, trying and testing themselves out, gaining adoption. And over a period of time, as I said, Joanna, so we'll see them consolidated, because ultimately the amount of users and adoption will define which platform succeeds. Right, rest would have to follow suit, either interoperate, together, derive more value.
So I would say, Joanna, kind of agree with. It's part of with Munib and Carl, based on the earlier comments. It is a journey. It's evolution. We are already in the silos, as in, I would say the digital island's already here. In fact, I don't know about other banks, but I'm guessing, and corporates. We, for example, are taking a view in terms of, how many of these initiatives are we really we have our fingers and our hands into, and we really need to take stock and pull back a little bit, because it does take capacity and resources and effort. Right. So which are the ones now 2 years ago, it all started, and everybody wanted to be in everything. A lot of it was experimentation. But as we now come into kind of a 2-year horizon and looking into the future, we need to take some hard calls, right? In terms of which are the ones that's where are we going to place those bets and do it a little bit narrower. And if I take very quickly 2 quick examples, right? If you look at the airline industry, what happened with IATA, every airline used to have a different ticketing format, right, in the 70s, right, and before that, and then they IATA came out and standardized the ticketing format first, but it was still paper, right? And then they had their first electronic ticket in 1994. After 10 years, in 2004, they only had 19% conversion tickets. And by 2008, June, they were done, right? So it does ramp up after a certain point. So initially, you will have these silos. It will be different. But I think there will come an inflection point beyond which it will have to move, because if it doesn't, then it will be forced out in terms of in the players in the ecosystem, because scale has to build beyond a certain point. So I would say it's a journey. We are already in the silos piece. Some of it will work, some of it will consolidate. Interoperability will happen, standards will evolve, and there may not be a clear winner, but there may be a few large players eventually when the consolidation happens. Or there may be many providing multiple services on an integrated flow, but it has to make economic sense at the end of it compared to what we have as transaction costs today. But it's a journey, and hopefully we will get there one day, Joanna.
Yeah, no, I would again agree with both of you. Definitely a journey. I think it's too early to make any decisions on any platforms. No one has scale. Customers have to use it. There's a lot of stuff going on in pilot, right? Pilots it just means that people are interested in trying it, right? Rolling it out, right? In production, right? There's not a lot of stuff out in production yet, right? When it's in production, that's when you begin to look at what makes sense, who chooses what, and we sort of see where our customers ask us to join, connect with someone. We're like, absolutely, right? But I'm talking to about 70 different partners that want to work with us. I'm like, we have to prioritize. Do we have a customer nexus? Do we have a customer in common, a bank or a corporate? Then let's talk, right? And so if you have business and I have business, we have a customer in common, then that's an opportunity to break down the silos, connect, whatever it is, right? But if everyone's still in pilot, right, it's still a bit too early to make decisions.
That's great, guys. Really, I'm very grateful. I had a quick look at the chat function. I can't see any questions at the moment, and unfortunately, we are out of time. But I hear some very positive thoughts actually in terms of general positivity amongst the crowd that we're not going to end up ultimately in an environment where we have all these silos. We have digital islands today. Silos are real, but at the same time, we are in the early days, and it is a journey. And it certainly is an interesting journey in which we'll all need to work together. I think collaboration was a key theme here as well. And I just want to thank you all really for being such an excellent panel, and many thanks to the audience for listening.
Thank you, Joanna.
Thank you, Joanna. Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Goodbye.